One of the biggest challenges that network analysts face today is testing and understanding their coverage of detection. Now, Dragos was proud to be involved in the development of MITRE's attack for ICS threat behavior-based framework. And in my presentation today, I'm going to be talking about how Dragos has been using the attack for ICS framework internally to test and understand our coverage of detections and to share that information with executives and senior leaders. Now, during Dale's keynote on Tuesday, he challenged us to change our behavior. He challenged us to think differently, to solve problems that we continue to face in the industry. Unfortunately, we've failed in the past 10 years to really address the underlying issues with industrial cybersecurity threats. And attack for ICS represents a shift in focus, a shift away from network anomaly detection and technical indicators and more towards threat behavior. So if there's one takeaway you can have from my presentation today, it's to focus on understanding threat behavior. Why? Because context matters. Context matters. And threat behavior is the context behind the detections that matter. From my own personal experience, working at a Fortune 500 company and managing an OT SOC that leveraged network anomaly detection, I struggled. I struggled trying to whitelist the right detections, trying to prioritize the detections that mattered. We had 80,000 events occurring every day, and it was difficult to understand what we should be looking at and what detections might be part of a larger attack. And I struggled because I didn't understand the threat behaviors that the adversaries were using to target our environment. And but the threat behavior provides context. It's an important thing to understand, and would have helped me quite a bit. Now, threat behavior also provides adversary pain, right? It's difficult to change. We're all creatures of habit. It's hard to change our behavior over time. And it's the same for adversaries. Now, David Bianco created this pyramid of pain, which I've adapted to focus on the ICS threat detection that we've used over the past 10 years. And the pain in the pyramid of pain is the adversary pain when they're forced to adapt, when they're forced to change their behavior. At the very tip of the pyramid, we have the most acute pain. And as we work our way down the pyramid, the pain gets less and less. And starting at the bottom here, network anomaly detection, from an adversary perspective, it's not very difficult to live like an operator in the network. It doesn't cause them a lot of pain. From my own personal experience doing industrial penetration testing, most of the time we're harvesting credentials of the existing operators or domain admin and moving through the network just like the operators do. So it's difficult to pick out those network anomalies or those detections because they're really no different from the way the operators behave. And if you shift your time zone to be on the same time zone as the site, or you do your attack during a turnaround or an outage, it's going to be really hard to distinguish you from normal network activity. Moving up the pyramid of pain towards indicators, when tools and hashes and threat reports are published, adversaries are required to change their hashes, change their signatures in order to reduce their opportunities to get detected. And I mean, it's a bit painful to have to recompile tools or change IPs or domain names, change all your infrastructure, but it's not a ton of pain. It's a bit of pain, but not too painful. At the very top of Dave Bianco's pyramid of pain is threat behavior. Threat behavior is very difficult to change. It's like a forklift upgrade of your techniques, your tactics and procedures. It requires a significant retrain and retool of your priorities to make that shift, to make that change. So threat behavior provides context. It's also difficult for adversaries to change. Threat behaviors are also resilient. I like to say ICS networks change daily, threat indicators change weekly, and threat behaviors change annually. From an operator perspective, as a network analyst, to implement network anomaly detection, at first it's relatively easy. You create a baseline, and then it's a matter of using machine learning or AI algorithms, things like that, to detect changes of the baseline. And over time, this can become a bit cumbersome because turns out ICS networks are a bit more dynamic than we realized, right? So there's a lot of changes that are occurring all the time, and you start to get into this whitelisting tuning habit, which can eat up a lot of your time. So to operationalize that, it can be quite difficult. And at the end of the day, when you're looking for changes in ICS networks, it's not really threat detection without context. It's just change detection. So that can be quite painful. I mean, in my experience, working with an anomaly-based system, we were looking at upwards of 80,000 detections a day, and it was really hard to sift through the noise, try to separate that signal from noise in that kind of environment. Indicators, threat-based indicators to operationalize, pretty easy. You know, you got your sticks, your taxis, you can automate that weekly ingest pretty without too much difficulty. But it still requires someone to look at it, someone to study it and work with that data to incorporate that and use that in the environment. To operationalize it, it's not too difficult. But threat behavior, it's a resilient rule. Like, it's difficult for the adversary to change, so those behaviors will last an extended amount of time. But it's difficult to operationalize threat behavior, to create those complex detections, because they require multiple pieces of data across multiple different systems that you would bring together to try to paint that picture of the threat behavior. It's important to understand what's changing on your network. It's important to have threat indicators, but it's even more important to have the context behind them, to have the threat behaviors and create those complicated rules or network analyst playbooks that allows you to know what to look for. For example, when I was managing the OT-SOC, I wouldn't have known that like a Python or a Python executable would be potentially part of a larger safety system attack. I didn't have the context to understand that or to see that, so I wouldn't have known to look for other things related to that based on that one detection. So we know that threat behavior is resilient, threat behavior is difficult for adversaries to change, and it provides the context. If only there was a single repository that enumerated all the industrial threat behavior in all the publicly known industrial threat behavior. Well, fortunately, there is. Attack for ICS has been created by MITRE over the past 2 years. They've gone to all the effort to catalog and organize and categorize all the different threat behaviors that have occurred in the past 20 years. And then that to one website that we can all access. Before Attack for ICS, to really understand threat behavior, we would have had to pull data from multiple sources, look at lots of different intel reports, and kind of create our own database to get that overall picture of threat behavior. Fortunately, Attack for ICS exists today, and we can all benefit from it. And how does it work, really? So Attack for Enterprise has existed for quite some time now, but there has been a need for some of these very specialized areas where it doesn't quite fit in Attack for Enterprise, where the tradecraft is very specific to the industry or the target environment. So as new reports come out and new blog articles are published and new news feeds are put out there, the MITRE folks diligently map that to Attack for Enterprise. And everything else, it's kind of like a waterfall effect. Everything else that doesn't quite fit in Attack for Enterprise will fall into these other buckets. They'll fall into Attack for Cloud, Attack for Mobile, and Attack for ICS. So that ICS-specific behavior will end up in Attack for ICS. So what does it look like? If you're familiar with Attack, you'll be familiar with this, but and unfortunately, Attack for ICS, the matrix is too big to show on one slide, so I've just taken a little bit of a subset of it here just to demonstrate what it looks like. But along the top, we have the tactics, which are the technical goals of the adversary, what they're trying to accomplish in the network. And on the left-hand side, we have the techniques, which are what the adversary uses to try and achieve their goals. So this gives us a nice matrix view of the tactics and techniques used by threat actors that are targeting ICS environments. And we've been using this matrix as a dashboard internally to help track our coverage of detection. We'll just literally copy and paste this HTML table into Excel and use macros and other things to highlight different things, to show different views of different adversaries that we track, and to show our coverage of detection to our executives. So let's take a look at the breakdown by the numbers. So within Attack for ICS, we've got 11 ICS-specific tactics, 81 ICS-specific techniques, and a list of 475 specific references to ICS tradecraft. These are public articles and blogs and intel reports of the specific tradecraft in the ICS world. And then we also have 17 ICS software malware tools. So quite a good chunk of content, but nothing compared to Attack for Enterprise, of course. Now, what's the breakdown? The obvious question is, what's the overlap between Attack for Enterprise versus Attack for ICS? Now, there's always going to be some overlap. And if we take a look at this, the Purdue model here on the left, the overlap for enterprises is a bit stronger in the IT side, with the entering into the corporate network and traversing into the ICS network. That's going to have a lot more of the enterprise-like techniques. But as we get further down into the OT network, the behaviors and the techniques are really more ICS-focused. So there's always that overlap, but let's take a look at what that looks like, what the breakdown is between IT and OT techniques. So with the 81 techniques in there today, 73% of them are very specific to OT environments, and only 27 are specific to IT techniques that would map to enterprise. So what does that mean? What does that break down to? So we'll drill into this a little bit further and take a look by tactic. These are the 11 tactics in Attack for ICS. And I've highlighted the red one at the top is almost entirely Attack for Enterprise. And it's no surprise, it's command and control, right? So that's going to be C2 infrastructure, things coming from the internet, the initial access into the environment, and lateral movement, and things like that are very IT heavy. But when we move down to the green parts of the chart, we can see some of the tactics like inhibit response function, impair process control, and impact process are almost 100% or are 100% OT techniques. And everything in between is really a mix of the two. There's a good mix of IT and OT techniques under those techniques. So who uses Attack for ICS? One of the biggest use cases today is for analysts. It does provide a standard lexicon for the threat behaviors and tactics that we can ensure we're kind of on the same page when we're talking about attacks, to have a conversation across different teams or organizations. It's also very valuable from a training perspective. It would have been handy for me to have 4 years ago when I was doing the OT-SOC to understand the threat behaviors, to study up on Attack for ICS, to really understand what that looks like for the OT-SOC. And IR threat hunters can use it as well to look for that specific behavior. And pen testers. Actually, this was the original purpose of Attack, was adversary simulation. When it was originally created, they were using it to simulate threat behavior they've seen in the past. But it's also very helpful when you're looking to test your coverage of detection. You'll want to, a good offense makes a good defense, so putting detections in place without testing them, it doesn't make a lot of sense. You want to make sure that these detections are being tested. You've got PCAPs, you've got methods of testing that the detections actually work. And also identifying crown jewels, the systems that you'll want to protect can help you understand that. But most importantly, Attack for ICS is a tool which can be used to communicate coverage of detection and gaps in detection to executives and C-level decision makers, so they can understand where they need to invest and where their gaps are and where the overlaps are in their detection. So in my experience looking at Attack for ICS, pound for pound, network traffic analysis can get you most of the way there. But there's always some detections and techniques that you'd need to collect from a host. And there's always some that only forensic analysis can provide detections for. But most of the time you can use network and traffic analysis to detect the techniques in attack for ICS. But it's important to have both. There's a lot of overlap between host and network traffic analysis, which is why the Dragos platform absorbs event logs from hosts as well as the PCAPs. So you have that overlap. You can have that breadth and depth of detection. Now, when I was working with MITRE last year, the best way for me to test and support MITRE and provide feedback was for me to actually exercise the framework, was to do what MITRE does every day. They take Intel reports, they take data, and they try to map it to the framework. So I went through the exercise of mapping all of our 11 activity groups that we track at Dragos to the attack for ICS framework. And I found that not every activity group, of course, penetrates all the way into the ICS network. A lot of them have an intent in doing that, but we lack data. We seem to lack data on a lot of the activity groups to cover across all of the tactics. So if you take a look by tactic coverage across the 11 activity groups, we have a lot of coverage on Xenotime and Electrum, where there's been a lot of reporting, and we were involved in the incident response and collected a lot of that data firsthand. But some of the other ones, there's not full coverage across tactics, either because we're lacking data or because they never breached into the ICS networks. Another view of looking at that, we can see the activity groups that were able to make an ICS disruption, Xenotime and Electrum, and a few others that have been able to get ICS access or recon, and the other ones that have shown intent or interest in the ICS environment but haven't breached or developed that capability yet. Or maybe they're part of another team that was supporting a different team. So it's difficult to say, but we don't have evidence or any documented evidence of them breaching or creating an ICS disruption. So let's go through the exercise. Let's step through mapping some Xenotime behavior with their Trisis malware, which attacked safety systems using attack for ICS. What does that look like? So if we use attack for ICS today and open up the lateral movement tactic and go into the remote file technique, we can see there's a reference to Trisis there. Trisis is a compiled Python script using a publicly available Py-to-exe compiler. So we know that we should be detecting file transfers of Python or compiled Python files in the network, as it might be part of a larger safety system attack. And if we look in the tactic under collection and detect program state, Xenotime, the Trisis malware, would attempt to detect the key position of the safety controller. It would only really work when the key position was in the remote setting, which means the running safety controller could be programmed remotely. If the key position was in run, they wouldn't be able to make changes to the controller. You may wonder, like, why would you ever have your safety system in remote rather than run? Well, there's always a challenge with getting access to these panels at times. It may require special paperwork, or there's also the added risk if you need to turn that key every time you program it. If you turn it too far and put it into program mode or stop, the whole safety system shuts the plant down, and then you spend the next week trying to get it up and running again. So we find in our assessments, a lot of plants run their PLCs and safety systems in remote, just because the operational risk is higher than the cybersecurity risk. Looking at the inhibit response tactic, there's a program download where Xenotime would drop the stager, the first part of the payload of Trisis, using the program download technique. So we'd want to make sure we have some detections around that stage 1 payload into the safety system. And then finally, the modify control logic under inhibit response. That's where Xenotime uploads the change in logic, which will inhibit the normal safety system operation. So getting a detection for that, or understanding to look for that as part of this threat behavior would be very important. So we can take those tactics and techniques and also map them to the ICS Kill Chain. So here we have stage 2 of the ICS Kill Chain, which is once an adversary is inside the ICS network, it goes from stage 1 to stage 2, as you probably know. But we can see the lateral movement. The remote file copy of the Python would go into the deliver stage, And then we've got 2 under install modify, where we detect the key position and then do the stage 1 install. And finally, the execution of the ICS attack would be the modification of the control logic in the safety controller to inhibit that response. So this would be the sort of dashboard that we would create to show Rob Lee, actually, to show him our coverage of this detection. We would use different colors and different schemes in an Excel spreadsheet to highlight the techniques for different activity groups to show our depth and breadth of detections within the environment. So this is some method you can visually show your coverage of detection. So once you get that base breadth of detection, you can focus on getting more depth. You know, when you have some ICS experts who understand multiple different systems, you can expand those detections for other safety system vendors. You know, the next time Xenotime targets an industrial environment, it may not be running the Triconic safety system. It might be an Emerson safety system. It might be another vendor safety system. So having similar detections for other vendors can help expand that depth of detection. And they might switch to PowerShell from Python. So looking for different payloads, encryption or obfuscation of payloads to broaden that behavior. Detection can help with future attacks. So what are some of the challenges that MITRE has faced with attack for ICS? Well, first of all, a small data set, especially compared to attack for enterprise. You know, attack for enterprise is huge, but we don't have a ton of information on attack for ICS. There's not a tremendous amount of referenceable public data on ICS attacks. There's still 475 specific references, so it's a substantial amount of data, but it doesn't compare to attack for enterprise. Another challenge, there's always going to be that balance of enterprise versus ICS, trying to get the right mix of content between the two. And I really think MITRE has done a good job with that 75-25 kind of breakdown of IT-OT content. You still need that IT context. You want to know how people are getting in and traversing into the ICS environment, but you don't need to know all the different enterprise tactics that they might be using. You want to really focus on the OT-specific tradecraft. And finally, vendor process vertical specific. The ICS landscape is so diverse. There's so many different control systems out there, different processes out there, and attack for ICS is trying to incorporate them all into one framework. So that's going to be a challenge. There's always going to be very specific techniques and specific tradecraft that might only apply to one vendor or one process. And there's already evidence of that. We see some of that today in attack for ICS, where there's techniques that just have the one reference. So maybe those will merge or change in the future, but we'll see as the tradecraft evolves. And in conclusion, threat-based behavior detections provide context. And context provides the context behind the detections that matter. They're resilient, they're difficult for adversaries to change, but they're also hard for us to operationalize. The rules are complex and require some very complex rules and playbooks to put them into place. But fortunately, attack for ICS exists now that can teach us about this threat behavior and make it easier for us to operationalize these threat behavior detections. And that's it. Any questions? You're all excited to go to the Cabana session, aren't you? Oh, yes, sorry, I didn't see it, the bright lights.
All right. So you give an example of how you can map a campaign to the framework. My question is, when you have like multiple campaign, what's your suggestion in correlating with different campaigns? Suppose you want to see like, I don't know, like which are both campaigns doing lateral movement or which are both campaigns using a specific malware type. So how, instead of putting in Excel or in the table you show, how you correlate different campaigns using the framework?
That's a great question. Internally, we've been using Google Docs, which is a version of Excel to map this data.
Yeah, sure.
And we've been manually creating these dashboards. But it would be really cool if there was a tool that would allow us to do this in a more fluid and dynamic manner.
Especially if you want to exchange your data with someone else.
Yes,
You
yeah.
know,
It'd be
and
great to
what-
have like an elastic dashboard or something like that that you could map this stuff in a more dynamic manner. But up to this point, we've just been using good old Excel as the tool to
starting
create these
point,
different
yeah.
views. And it's a lot of different sheets, like the the little tabs at the bottom of our Excel they go off into space. So
Future work. Okay, cool. Thank you.
thank you.
Someone else?
Do you have a plan to update the framework for in the future?
Absolutely. It's continuously evolving, continuously being added to by the MITRE team. We look forward to continuing our support and working with them as new threat behaviors come up. We want to make sure that they get mapped into attack for ICS. And we continue to provide feedback and give them some direction and things like that as they request it. So as new behaviors come up, it's going to go down that waterfall of going into the attack for enterprise, and then the OT-specific behaviors will trickle down into the ICS bucket. So it's going to be continuously evolving, just like attack for enterprise has been. So we'll only see this resource grow and the content continue to evolve, which is exciting.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.